you for joining me at Bert's Books, where this time we're going to be looking at this notorious item of Elvabilia, 1977's Elvis, What Happened, by Dave Hebler, Sonny West and Red West, as told to journalist Steve Dunleavy. A controversial tell-it-all expose on the personal demons, the vices and the all-round bad habits that plagued the greatest star in the rock and roll firmament, the King, Elvis Aaron Presley. Now, given Elvis's indisputable cultural and musical significance, we have this curious tendency to fixate less on his earth-shaking achievements or his talent, more on his very public deterioration from the pomaded rock and roll shock trooper of the 1950s to the bloated, Mogadon-riddled cabaret hack that he's posthumously become characterised as. As a public, we love nothing more than a spectacular burnout, and Elvis, whether fairly or not, has provided a rhinestone-crusted fixation point for our collective schadenfreude. Now, I first read this book in the early 90s, and in my mind it formed a part of a kind of kitschy suite alongside such items as the excruciating Having Fun with Elvis on Stage album, spoken word only.
It made no sense at all, did it? No sense at all.
All emblematic of the King's undignified fall from grace and our voyeuristic fascination with that. The book was collated by journalist Steve Dunleavy, a veteran of the Murdoch press, and it collated the reminiscences of three former Presley security men, all high rankers within the Memphis Mafia. It first appeared with either tragic or apt timing in the summer of 1977, short weeks before the book's subject dying. Ostensibly, the book was meant to serve as a wake-up call to the misfiring star to sort his act out, with an emphasis on his misuse of prescription drugs. Get rid of this fucking thing. The opening chapter transports us to the suite of a Las Vegas hotel in 1973. Elvis is partway through one of his residencies in the city, and on this night he summoned his faithful bodyguards, Sonny and Red West. Clearly distraught and definitely under the influence of substances, Sonny and Red's boss has an irksome task in mind for them. He requires them to either organise or to perform a hit job on Mike Stone, the karate instructor who's made off with Elvis's much neglected wife Priscilla. Elvis produces an M16, one of a large collection of firearms that he's accumulated, and he tries to press it into Sonny West's hands, attempting to hypnotise the bodyguard into agreeing with his repeated imprecations, while the star's romantic attachment of the time, Linda Thompson, pleads with him to calm down. Fortunately, one of Elvis's regular doctors is on hand with a tranquiliser shot, so the crisis is put on hold for the night, but it's not something that E is going to let go of easily, not before Red has been coerced into making a vague promise of making some calls. Usually considered as tough men that you wouldn't mess with, both cousins Sonny and Red confess to being strangely suggestible when it comes to relations with their boss. The situation festers for a few more days, Red fending off Elvis's queries with more vague promises, until mercifully their boss finally cools down and admits that perhaps it's a bit too heavy. Now, what an opening! I've read some high-tension biographies, musical or otherwise, but, wow, as an introduction to a biography on one of the biggest names, the biggest name in entertainment, this passage remains to this day utterly shocking. More so that it was lined up for publication, unstopped by any managerial challenges, or apparently unstopped by any legal challenges, while Elvis was still alive. By way of juxtaposition, we're whisked back from this unappetising tableau of success to the beginnings. Red West and Elvis are on nodding terms back at Humes High School, where Red remembers Elvis as a quiet, respectful sort of kid, but one who provokes a reaction. Red's capacity as a bruiser is called upon one day in 1952, on which Elvis's leather jacket, his jeans and his pride and joy, his gunked up pompadour, have earned him an arse-kicking from a pack of crew-cut jocks. And while the chronically shy Elvis only acknowledges Red's favour tacitly, it's one that he doesn't forget. It effectively establishes Red West as Elvis's protector, a role that he would come to carry out for much of the next quarter century. Red's cousin Sonny would recall his own first experience of Elvis, which is at a live show a couple of short but transformative years after this, on which Sonny's corn-fed southern belle of a date for the night is transformed into a knicker-wetting nymphette by the libidinous nature of the stage show, and all this from a kid that is remembered as a bit of an extravagantly dressed nobody from school. Sonny would come to witness a lot more of this once he joins his cousin a couple of years later in working security for Elvis, an induction into the Memphis Mafia, by which point Elvis has long since transcended that local circuit to an unprecedented level of global superstardom. Significantly, Sonny also develops a similar protective streak towards his former schoolmate. Elvis has one reservation about Sonny: his habitual use of the expression "son of a bitch." This reveals something about their boss's mindset, a deep-rooted devotion to his mother Gladys. The word was a trigger for him, and Sonny recalls one occasion in the early 60s in which his boss reveals the reverse side to his personality. He's cursed out by a party guest, deservedly, according to this account, who uses that expression on him, and she nearly gets impaled by Elvis's pool cue for her troubles. Sonny finds himself trying to talk her out of a lawsuit, though he knows full well that she would have right on her side. It was second nature for me to stand up for him, even when I knew he was very wrong. Dave Hebler is a relative latecomer to the Memphis Mafia, being inducted in the early 70s after assisting the star in saving face at a karate event, at which Elvis is not only out of his depth among genuine experts, but he's also shown up a bit medicated. Hebler is astute enough to realise that while Elvis did have some natural ability in this area, that he'd lacked the dedication. He also correctly reads the signals that the would-be karate king is pretty loaded. That said, Hebler is not immune to the formidable Presley charm and is similarly inclined to show him loyalty. Having made the introductions to these key characters, the book takes us backwards and forwards through time. Naturally, it's part of the book's remit after all. There are heavy helpings of dirt. A naive young fan, Jane Robertson, is first romanced by the king after a show in 1971, before he introduces her to the dubious delights of his medicine cupboard. A journey she's ill prepared for, and which culminates in a near fatal overdose. Personality-altering experience for her that Elvis breezes away from scot-free. Sonny describes his boss by this stage as a walking drugstore. Another unusual personality quirk of Presley's, which Hebler experiences early on, is the tendency towards spontaneous outbursts of absurd generosity. When he's in the mood to, he'll buy people top-of-the-range cars at the drop of a hat. Lovely, of course. It's hardly an indicator of fiscal savvy on the star's part. More disturbingly, Hebler soon becomes witness to another dominating fetish, that for handguns. While these southern boys aren't exactly fazed by such hardware, Red reveals that his boss is kinky about them. I mean kinky. While his bodyguards are accustomed to handling firearms with respect, Elvis is outright careless with them, even prone to letting them off at the TV set if a personality that's disagreeable to him should flash up in the schedule. One time a spent ricochet hits regular physician Dr. Nick, who comes through this relatively criticism-free, by the way. Luckily, the velocity is spent by this point. Taken in context with the volatile temper, often drug influence that we've already glimpsed, the guns are a real worry to the crew. Hebler comments, "I'm nervous around anyone who doesn't handle a gun with the same care that you'd handle a rattler." An extension of this gun fixation is a fascination with law and order, an obsession in ingratiating himself with enforcement agencies. This culminates in a bizarre audience with Richard Nixon in 1971, at which Elvis blags, with no sense of irony, a federal narcotics badge, followed by an even more bizarre Charles Bronson fantasy in 1976, in which Elvis dabbles with the role of armed avenger to take out wrongdoers who the police have failed to bring to book. These personality changes and the over-dependency on medications are traced back to Elvis's movie sets, most notably 1957's Jailhouse Rock, for which Elvis seemed to assimilate some of his character's less appealing traits. An expectation to be pampered, and little flashes of rage that would increase with time. Now, as dark as all this gets, it's difficult not to laugh at certain aspects of Elvis's erratic behaviour. His decidedly flaky dabblings with the mystical, which are indulged rather than encouraged by his bodyguards, lead to some outright bizarre faith-healing incidents and a series of absurd, almost certainly drugged up, biblical sermons on Elvis's part. Woe all ye motherfuckers of kind words. I'm sorry. Woe. Woe all ye motherfuckers of kind words and good deeds. And various ecclesiastical pearls along the lines of Jesus said he was old and of age and he fell ass backwards in the dust. The assembled throng of Memphis Mafia and guests summoning a superhuman effort not to laugh. Much like Michael Jackson after him, Elvis acquires a chimp. Scatter has the habit of molesting himself in front of the ladies. There's another incident in front of a live audience with his former wife in attendance, at which Elvis indulges in some jaw-dropping inappropriateness, announcing that Mike Stone ain't got no balls. Priscilla apparently takes this in her stride. By the 70s, Presley's various vices and his unmanaged personality tics have escalated to the point that they're starting to spill over into public view. He sails increasingly close to the wind in live performance, and it's only the collective audience loyalty that stops reports of his behaviour blowing up into greater public scandal. Aside from all this, there's a certain amount of detail about Presley's sexual activities and preferences. The book points out that compared to what had become standard in Hollywood, Elvis wasn't all that off the scale, but his proclivities contributed to the neglect that his wife Priscilla experienced, leading to the inevitable bust-up and Priscilla's disappearance with Mike Stone, which was a monumental thorn in the star's side and perhaps a contributory factor to his inclinations towards self-anaesthesia. And so the downward spiral reaches its final twists. In 1976, Elvis's father, Vernon, cuts the boys loose from the payroll. There are differing theories as to why this happened. The reason they were given was that it was a money-saving exercise. And you see what I mean about all those Cadillacs. Well, we know how Elvis's story ends, but bear in mind that this book would have gone to the printers by July of 1977. So in fact, the final passage is a transcript of a conciliatory phone call. Parts of it are quite endearing, really, in which Presley attempts a bit of bridge building with Red West, citing cool hand Luke as in the failure to communicate, and signing off by saying that Red should do what he has to do regarding this book, but that Elvis would always be there for Red and his wife. So just as this ends, Elvis ends, August 1977. Initially, many of his faithful had been suspicious of this title, the feeling being that it was a route to quick cash from some aggrieved ex-employees. However, the fact of Elvis's death and the circumstances that came out around it did lend some credibility to many of the claims within. The Wests and Hebler always maintained that this was intended as a shape-up message to their former boss, and they do come over as fairly sincere on that point. For all the grime within, there's still the feeling that there's a level of affection and loyalty for Elvis which had never quite been eroded. There's never any attempt to downplay Elvis's extraordinary talents and qualities. The book acknowledges that when Elvis is even part way involved or focused on a project, that he's untouchable. This book does benefit from insider perspectives, particularly on Red's part, who was with Elvis from the very early days. His account of life in the eye of the hurricane during Elvis's rise from high school jock quarry to international stardom. Okay, I can't vouch for the accuracy of this, not being an Elvis obsessive myself, but that section of the narrative is just extraordinary. And it may account for the fact that, apart from our appetite for scandal, this book went on to become one of the better-selling Elvis-related volumes after his death. Of course, to some extent, the Memphis Mafia formed part of the mechanisms of indulgence that fatally cosseted Elvis into a perpetual state of adolescence. In fairness, they seem to have been more vocal than some. Red attempts a heart-to-heart with his boss around 1975. He's rewarded with a colossal tantrum for his efforts. It's clear that Elvis's celebrity status from a relatively young age has inhibited the processes of maturity which in most individuals would temper their more impulsive urges. We form a picture of an artist who's phenomenally successful, but he's isolated, he's deprived of real artistic challenges, and it's prone to extreme boredom. You have to raise an eyebrow at some of Colonel Tom Parker's decisions here, although he's not really singled out for criticism in this. Out of any meaningful creative challenge, which was the case for much of Elvis's career, the more negative side of his personality seems to take hold. The star's eccentricities cross the line into what it's tempting to characterise as particularly American vices. Reckless consumerism, the overindulgence in one's appetites, culinary or otherwise, a weird double standard over drug use. It's to be treated with disdain if it's connected with law breaking, but you can fill your boots if some dodgy quack is part of your supply chain. And not least, there's a worrying bonk-on for firearms. Hebler describes Presley as a composite of contradictions. Probably fitting if you consider that at the time of his appearance, Elvis was considered a threat to societal values. He was going to wriggle his hips and ruin your sister's virtue, even though he was simultaneously a shy boy who was deferential to his elders. It's worth pointing out also that Elvis is seen to be capable of great selflessness, which is manifest in his relationship with his mother Gladys, whose early departure from Elvis's life would have had a cataclysmically destabilising effect on him. Now, we're possibly more acclimatised now to the idea that our idols can be deeply flawed human beings. We fairly regularly have to resolve that you can love somebody's work but still acknowledge that they're capable of being an almighty arsehole. From that perspective, the book's a pretty riveting read, although you could probably also read it as an indictment on the condition of stardom itself, along with our ghoulish fascination with it, as much as of Elvis himself. It's worth pointing out, incidentally, that Dunleavy was the inspiration for Robert Downey Jr.'s performance in Natural Born Killers. In any case, I didn't feel I should rattle all this off without reminding myself what all the fuss was about, so I dived into a relatively late period Elvis performance, broadcast from Honolulu in 1973. I've got to say, while it's not without a side order of glitz, you spend a few minutes with the highlights of that and you can't fake that. Right, so job done, Elvis, but what a shame how it all had to end. I seem to have somehow got through all that without resorting to some horrible, corny impersonation. You want that, baby?
We go again, man. Looks like my horse just left.